So hello everybody. No, I hope you're doing well. Welcome to this first session of this seminar that we call in Técnica and Society. My name is Rodrigo, and together with Dusan, we have organized this seminar that seeks to reflect on the relationship between social theory and technique. So, thinking of this relationship is especially important if we consider the current technological landscape associated with artificial intelligence, digital media, algorithmic operation, and automation process. So in this context, we invite you to think about what does contemporary technical reality means for social theory, what sort of contemporary forms of social organization are contained in the eruption of the new information and communication technologies, or how to approach of some of social theories, activities like critique or understanding in a world that is increasingly indifferent on the intents of human beings. With this question, I leave you with Dusan, and thank you very much for your interest in participating in this seminar.
Hi, my name is Dusan Cotoreas. As Rodrigo mentioned before, we organized this seminar inspired by this distinction, the distinction between Técnica and society. At some point in history, this distinction was constitutive of a concept of a definition of society as a concept opposed to the instrumental reason of technique. For example, Max Weber and Werner Sombart debated some viewpoints on this topic in the early years of sociology. Later, this relationship took on a more complex or enigmatic trajectory in the light of the discourse of cybernetics or information theory. And so we think that today the rise of social studies of science and technology, or the rise of media studies and media philosophy, invite us to rethink this relationship between technique and society. And for this reason, we have planned this series of talks with researchers from different areas. And in this first session, we have as guest speaker, the sociologist David Beer, who will be introduced by Daniel Chernilo. This lecture will have a length of 40 minutes to be followed by 40 minutes discussion. Daniel is also in charge of the project, The Autonomy and Secularization of Modernity, a study in philosophical sociology, which is sponsoring and supporting this seminar. Now I leave you with Daniel.
Well, welcome everyone to this wonderful session. It's a pleasure and an honor to have David here with us. We've corresponded for a long time. We've done work together, but we hadn't had the chance to meet as closely as in person as this can be. So we're extremely happy to have him here. I see Rodrigo put on the chat the webpage David has with all his work, but I'll give you a very short introduction. David is a professor of sociology at the University of York, in a wonderful town in the north of England. He's an extremely prolific writer. He's written several books. I don't think I can count them, 7 or 8, perhaps more. He's written on a wide range of topics, from power to technology to social theory, simul, and new media. And the talk he's gonna give us today is part of his new book. I'm not gonna say more about it because I don't know a lot about it, and because I'm sure David will say more. But the last thing I want to say is that this seminar series belongs, on the one hand, to a research project, as Dusan mentioned, that tries to look at questions of secularization beyond religion, and the way in which different domains of social life and natural life and technological life are now kind of fully disenchanted, to use the Max Weber's terms. So we're trying to rethink what secularization means beyond the idea that we live in a secular or post-secular society, or where we're going through a linear progressive trajectory where religious beliefs are going to be replaced by secular beliefs, whatever that means. And on the other hand, it holds it also about the doctoral program that we run at Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez. We are a relatively small really enthusiastic doctoral program. We have people working in areas from economics to engineering, from philosophy to history, and we pride ourselves in doing interdisciplinary research. We don't know a lot about what we do ourselves, but we do know it has to be interdisciplinary. So it is hard to think of a better topic and a better colleague and a friend to start this seminar series. So welcome everyone. If people are not comfortable with their English, it's not a problem. You can put the questions on the chat in Spanish and some of us will translate. So the idea is that we communicate as much as, and we enjoy it as much as we can. So without further ado, on to you, David.
Thank you very much for the invite and everything. It's a real honour, and I'm very pleased to be able to address you. I'm just going to share my slides, whilst also checking. As you can, when you're speaking from home, I don't know if any of you have got cats, but as soon as I start doing that, my cat's decided to, there you go, come and bother me again. Okay, so yeah, so this is the topic of today's talk is, hopefully you can see the slides okay there. Is that really great? So it's interesting listening to the introduction there about the relationship to technology and society, but also some of the other issues that you're raising, because I was thinking of reflecting on the talk I'm about to give, and there's an element of kind of faith in the technology that I'm going to be talking through. It might be relevant in a way I didn't realise. So the talk is just about algorithmic thinking, neural networks, and the presences of non-knowledge. And I've been trying to think through this issue of algorithmic thinking, and I've taken neural networks as an example. So I'm just going to, that's kind of be the direction of the talk really, and it emerges from this book that I've just recently finished called The Tensions of Algorithmic Thinking. I'll explain what that is a little bit more in a moment. That's the book that this is taken from. I'm going to be talking about chapter 5 from this book today, the presences of non-knowledge, but I'm going to give you a little introduction to the overarching argument of which that's a part. So an argument about tensions in algorithmic thinking. Now, the argument of the book is you can only understand algorithms through an understanding of the tensions that they create. That's kind of a key argument in the book. So, which I'm not going to go into, but I'd be very happy to answer any questions that you got about the broader argument of the book that I'm just going to very briefly outline. Now, the book starts with borrowing from Henri Lefebvre in this introduction to modernity. One of the things Lefebvre talks about there is what he describes as kind of myths, the modern myths. A couple of quotes on the screen here from the 1960s and Henri Lefebvre's introduction to modernity. Now I borrow this to think about the myths of an algorithmic new life, the promises of what will come, what are just around the corner, the new developments and how they'll enhance our lives, and the power that those images of the just out of reach aspects of technologies have over us. So this is from Lefebvre, something we call a modern myth, which sees part of reality as an image of what is possible and what is not possible, sometimes illuminating it, sometimes hiding it from our eyes. It's the myth of the new life. So I was struck when I was reading this text from the 1960s that modernity was defined by the idea of the changes that were just to come, that were nearly here, and the new life that was just around the corner, that was just out of reach. This is Lefebvre as well. Any day now we would be entering the new life. This life was already there, close at hand, possible, almost a presence, but smothered, sidelined, absent, yet ever ready for the moment when it will be released into the open. So I start to think that's the version of modernity that Lefebvre is writing about. But when we think about the kind of algorithmic structures and the technological notions of the future we see now, we could see there's a kind of an algorithmic new life. we've got algorithms developing, but there's this sense of change, this sense of more algorithmic systems, more automation, more artificial intelligence that's just around the corner and that will come and transform and bring a new life. So one of the things I'm interested in is not just the algorithmic structures that we've got in place now, but the promises of the new life that are associated with algorithmic systems and with the possibilities of automation. So when I talk in the book about algorithmic thinking, I'm talking about the thinking that is done by these systems themselves, as well as the thinking that is done about those systems. So I'm thinking about the way the systems are analysed and thought of and understood, as well as the thinking that they do themselves, the decisions they make, the choices they make, that kind of thing that go on within these systems as well. So by algorithmic thinking, I'm thinking of those two things together, how we think about algorithms and also the thinking done by these algorithmic structures. And what that led me to, and this was a book I had horrendous problems with working on, because algorithms and automation, artificial intelligence, tricky topics anyway. But I couldn't get the book to work. And what I realized was that I'd got two chapters that were saying exactly the opposite thing to each other once I'd started developing it. So I thought, well, actually, is this telling me something? Why have I got two completely different perspectives from the chapters I've written? That's when it struck me that what I was looking at was a set of tensions, a set of forces pulling in opposite directions to one another. So this was the kind of idea I'd had, was that the tensions, this doesn't capture all of the tensions of algorithmic thinking, but two prominent sets of tensions are these forces that are pulling opposite directions. So we've got in the on the vertical, we've got the human and humanlessness pulling against each other. So wanting to integrate humans into systems and wanting to remove humans from systems was one of the tensions I look at. The other one is on the horizontal here, is between the unknown and the known, or between the unknowable and the knowable, pulling in opposite directions. The pursuit of knowing more, and as I'll explore today, the pursuit of the unknowable, pulling in opposite directions. And these are the forces that then create tensions within algorithmic thinking. So what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the talk, just after that sort of brief introduction to the context from which this is emerging, is in this boxed area. So I'm going to focus on the tensions of the unknowable in algorithmic thinking and algorithmic systems. That's what I'm going to explore. Now, this gives a part of that tension, hopefully be able to fill in some of the gaps anyway in that line. So what can be known and what can't be known. So I'm looking at the what can't be known in this talk, which takes me to the neural network. Now, I'm looking at advanced forms of automation in this talk, but I'm thinking of them historically. Okay, let me just say, I need to move my the image of myself out of the way so I can actually see the quotes. So back in 1994, reflecting on the direction of rapidly advancing systems and neural network technologies, the Nobel Prize-winning neural systems expert Leon N. Cooper was reflecting on what the future might yet hold. So we're comfortable with computers that enhance our logic, our memory, and we'll be comfortable with reasoning machines. So the idea we'll be comfortable in the future with reasoning machines, machines that have their own reason. We'll interact with them. I think they will come just in time because of the kinds of problems we have to solve, these very complex problems that are beyond the capacity of our minds. So this comes up a lot, the notion that what these systems can do is move beyond the capacity of a single mind. So it's probably solved in interactions with such machines. So the idea that these machines then will become companions to our thinking, that will be beyond the capacity of our minds, beyond the limits of the mind and into the unexplainable. So again, that's somebody imagining, that's one of these sort of neuroscientists imagining the future back in 1994 and where we might end up. So you've already got then the idea of a machines coming with that are reasoning capacities and that are operating beyond the human thinking. Here's another example of that. This is a software researcher, neurocomputing engineer, Robert Heck Nielsen, also in the mid-1990s, saying this: as we go forward, we're going to see the ever-growing capabilities of machines take over more and more activities that humans themselves perform. So the idea that you're taking on more capacity, more parts of the social world will become automated. Hopefully there'll be some rational selection of those activities, but probably not. So not even a lot of hope there of a rationality, going back to the Weber that Daniel mentioned in the introduction. And we will see this technology that we all know and love really become the last human technology. So the neural network is envisioned as the last human technology. The reason for this is because it will come to automate itself. So to become the last human technology, back to the quote, because what will happen is that by a few hundred years from now, there won't be any human technologists. The machines will in fact be intelligent, and they will take on the role of building machines and designing machines and taking our orders and carrying them out. So here you've got what Luciano Parisi called the automation of automation, the step in which technologies come to design themselves. Okay, we just give them orders and they go away and do it, kind of thing. So that's kind of a couple of neural network scientists thinking about the future and technologists thinking about the future back in the mid-1990s. And we start there to see instantly the notion of the unexplainable, of operating beyond the limits of the known, being part of the way that these technologies were being imagined and therefore created through their work. So I'm just taking you back to George Simmel. I was trying to think through the lens of George Simmel quite often on these sorts of things. And this is from Simmel's work on secrecy. Around the turn of the 20th century, wrote this short piece, or short book really, essay. And he says, Simmel says, whatever quantities of knowing and not knowing must commingle in order to make possible the detailed practical decision based upon confidence will be determined by the historic epoch, the ranges of interests and the individuals. The objectification of culture referred to above has sharply differentiated the amounts of knowing and not knowing essential as the conditions of confidence. So for Simmel, in any social arrangement, there's this negotiation of confidence in the known and in the not known. And it's this arrangement of the relationship between the not known and the known that changes over times and through context, but that establishes a confidence essentially in what's knowable and what isn't knowable. Okay, so Simmel identified this balancing of knowing and not knowing that occurs. And this is where I think there's a change occurring in this balancing of the knowing and not knowing through these developments that I'll be talking about. And that therefore, the confidence required, it's not just about the fact that new technologies alter that, it's about the way we then establish a confidence in the new unknowns that are created. The things that are not known are part then of how legitimacy is established in systems. So I'm going to take neural networks as an example, because they're an advanced form of algorithmic thinking, an advancing form of automation, increasingly established in loads of types of data analytics and systems of automation, artificial intelligence. I'm focusing in upon the neural network in order to explore this confidence in the unknown. So this is, you could relate this to what Louisa Moore calls their regimes of recognition. So neural networks have a set of regimes of recognition, features that we identify and that they identify in the world around us. And that these regimes of recognition then produce intentions between the knowable and the unknowable. They're reconfiguring that confidence Simmel spoke about. An unexplainability then in these neural networks, as I'm going to go on to explore, is something that's actively pursued in the advancement of those systems. It's not just about the black box, it's aiming for unexplainability. So the authenticity and validity of neural networks are based upon the very presence of unknowability. Unknowability is part of how the system is legitimized and validated. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take Georges Bataille's notion of non-knowledge as a way of exploring this a little bit more. I'm going to use that as the concept to explore these issues that I'm pointing towards here. And in particular, the kind of ideals, developments and mutations of neural networks, depths and layers. So the depths and layers are where the non-knowledge is being explored and cultivated and where it's being actively pursued within these systems. The depths and layers of neural network. I'm just going to turn first to look at what Bataille says about non-knowledge, because this is Bataille's term, non-knowledge. I'm going to look at what Bataille says about that, and then I'm going to look at the neural networks before then thinking what this suggests to us as a kind of set of possibilities for thinking. So across a range of lectures and short writings, they're quite incomplete. It's a bit note-like, a bit scattered. Bataille was thinking through the 1950s, and he sort of returns to it periodically, the concept of non-knowledge. Some of you might be familiar with this, some of you are probably more familiar with it than I am, but let me just explore what the notion of non-knowledge means for Bataille as far as I'm able to extract it from these fragments. Here's some examples of what Bataille says. A proposition that isn't logically doubtful, but that makes the mind uneasy. It induces an imbalance, an object independent of any subject. So there's a kind of looseness, a sense of the uneasiness it brings on, a sense of imbalancing. So back to that balancing of the known and the unknown that Zimmel spoke about. Here you get an imbalance created. The non-knowledge that I'm talking about, Bataille says, is in search of its consequences, is everywhere. So we're surrounded by non-knowledge, but we gain an awareness of it periodically for different reasons. Okay. And then back to Bataille, to specify what I mean by non-knowledge, that which results from every proposition when we are looking to go to the fundamental depths of its content, which makes us uneasy. So as we explore non-knowledge, its instability and limitlessness makes us feel uneasy. It imbalances us. The sort of lack of structure of it, the lack of limits and boundaries, it opens up those potential limits, but also creates a sense of imbalance and unease at what we don't know. So the concept of non-knowledge then is intended as an awareness of the limits of knowledge, coupled with an awareness there is more that resides beyond those limits, but we're not sure what it is. So there's a couple of things I want to highlight in Bataille before moving on. So stability is important in these arguments. Knowledge demands a certain stability of things known. So knowledge requires a stability of the things we know. In any case, the domain of the known is, in one sense at least, a stable domain where one recognizes oneself, where one recovers oneself, whereas in the unknown, there isn't necessarily any movement. Things can even be quite immobile, but there is no guarantee of stability. So this is continuous with Bataille's quote, stability can exist, but there is not even any guarantee as to the limits of the movements that can occur. So when knowledge seems stable because of its limits, non-knowledge seems unstable because of its lack of limits. Now that means there's possibility as well, because you're not constrained by the limits of knowing. So if you imagine if you're developing an artificial intelligence automated system, that ability to have no limit on what is known can potentially open up possibilities. So non-knowledge is important for Bataille because it also allows the social world to function, or aspects of the social world function on the presence of non-knowledge, a little bit like Zimmel pointed us towards. But Bataille is talking in particular terms, and he frequently uses laughter and death as examples of this. So this is back to Bataille. Suppose that the laughable is not only unknown, but unknowable. We still have to envisage a possibility. The laughable could simply be the unknowable. In other words, the unknown character of the laughable would not be accidental, but essential. In other words, we need the unknown for laughter to function properly. There needs to be an element of non-knowledge for Bataille, for a limitlessness, an instability and unease that's created by these sort of gaps in understanding that laughter presents to us. So laughter works through non-knowledge. It needs elements of non-knowledge. It can't, for it to be, it can't be fully conceived. So it might be, if we take in Bataille's approach here, that laughing and artificial intelligence have something in common here, which is that they both, as I'm going to go on to explain now, require the unknown and the unknowable in order to function. Now, what that means is that there are places in which the non-knowledge is pursued. So we think of these developments often as the pursuit of knowledge. For Bataille, there are times when we pursue non-knowledge because we want that limitlessness. We want possibility. Okay, this is what I'm going to argue about these neural networks in a moment. So let's just, there's the last quote from Bataille, I think I've got, about the pursuit, so trying to achieve non-knowledge. Bataille, because there is a desire for non-knowledge, so pursuit of non-knowledge comes because there's a desire for non-knowledge, to be delivered from the bonds of knowledge, so to remove those bonds, to remove those boundaries, even if knowledge is reassuring. The changes of the possible into the impossible. So as soon as you move to non-knowledge, you change what's possible and what's impossible. Of knowledge into non-knowledge, from the moment when the possible is systematized and when the impossible is no longer evasive. If the entirety of the possible subsists, do not make themselves known through the ordinary method of knowledge to the contrary. So quite a tricky long sentence essentially there. But what I want us to focus on here is that the instability and limitlessness, or the seeming instability and limitlessness of non-knowledge, are appealing. There's a desire then for non-knowledge, because non-knowledge can seem to bring possibilities that rest beyond the limits of what's known and open up potentially new spaces and possibilities. That's the idea. So non-knowledge is required, I'm going to argue, for these systems to function. So let me take you to the neural network now and give you some instances of this before moving towards a conclusion. So neural network creates sort of new depths of non-knowledge. This branch of automated systems of algorithmic thinking creates new depths of non-knowledge. So the neural network, and this oral history of neural networks that's on the screen here is a kind of data set that I've essentially used in part along with other sources to try to piece this story together a little bit. So neural networks, it's an attempt to understand the human nervous system and to then build artificial systems that act the way we do, at least a little bit, Anderson and Rosenfeld said. So these neural networks are an attempt to replicate aspects of the human brain in terms of how they work and how they think, which of course then takes into the realm of something that's very difficult to fully know. This is Anderson and Rosenfeld again back in the 90s. Many early developments of brain theory sprang from the roots of cybernetics, with other theories taking inspiration from neuroscience, physics, electrical engineering, mathematics, and even economics. They're taking these sources and thinking about how the brain works, but how the sort of neural theory emerges out of other sources, but then is recycled back into trying to understand or trying to develop these neural network systems. So that's keeping that non-knowledge in mind. Depths in neural networks are really important, depths and layers. This is Hardesty talking about neural networks and what's also referred to as deep or machine learning sometimes. So deep learning is in fact a new name for an approach to artificial intelligence called neural networks. which have been going in and out of fashion for more than 70 years. This is a common narrative in neural networks that people have been working on for a long time. They come in and out of fashion. The most recent is in the notion of deep learning. Neural networks were first proposed, Ardessi says, in 1944 by Warren McCulloch, Walter Pitts in the picture there. Two University of Chicago researchers who moved to MIT 1952 as founding members of what's sometimes called the first cognitive science department, so the notion of cognitive science. And they began developing these neural network systems that they thought were working like they understood the brain to work. But this is based on on the understanding of the brain and how then that could be adapted in these systems. So according to Harry Collins, the STYS researcher, Harry Collins, a core idea of neural networks is that although they're initially written by a human, once written, the program lives its own life. The program lives its own life, as it were, without huge effort. Exactly how the program is working can remain mysterious. Here we've got the non-knowledge coming through. For it to function, it remains mysterious. So we get some of these ideas then coming through in different forms about sort of what I'm calling non-knowledge and these mysteries within the systems. So it's about what lies in the depths, I think, is another way of thinking of this in terms of the imagery. So Lepage-Richter notes that neural networks are conceived as models of knowledge, acquisition based on the operization of what lies beyond the limits of knowledge. So they're designed to reside beyond the limits of knowledge. The core property that unites the different systems encompassed by the concepts of neural networks appears to not so much be their structural similarities. So they can vary in structure. It's like an umbrella term for lots of systems. Lepage-Richter points out, but rather their shared conceptualization of the unknown as something that can be contained and operationalized by networks of interconnected units. So this is lying beyond the human understanding, beyond the human system, aiming to create a space of non-knowledge in the depths of these systems. So Mark Andrzejewicz, just give you a couple of examples of this. And what, Bataille talks about sort of knowing that you don't know, which is one of the things that's behind non-knowledge, knowing you don't know. Andrzejewicz notes that the former Google engineer oversaw the neural networks that learned to recognize cat photos, admitted that he didn't know how the system worked. So there's an acknowledgement in these accounts of not fully knowing how the system works that you're creating, of it working beyond those limits. So this is, I think, what Bataille refers to as the consciousness of the absence of consciousness in these systems. The aim to be unexplainable is about the consciousness of the absence of consciousness. So the presence of non-knowledge even seems to promote a sense of authenticity in the system. And you get this coming through in different ways. So as Collins says, to go to this idea of depth, so it's hidden in the depths, layers of neurons in modern versions of neural nets. So there's layers of neurons. Interview with the Financial Times, Ila Norbakash talks about this sort of hidden layers. That's and the advancement of these systems. They observe that the odd irony of AI, of artificial intelligence, the best systems happen to be the ones that are least explainable. So you're aiming to create systems that can't be explained. Catherine Ailes also notes, the media theorist, recursive architectures limits how much we know about the system, a result relevant to the hidden layer in neural networks, deep learning systems. So not only have you got depths, you've got what are described as hidden layers within a neural network. So that is like almost the epitome of a systematic non-knowledge, a hidden layer. So we're going to look at the way that layers have created greater and greater depth in these systems. And this is certain developments more recently have led to the increase of layers. Modern GPUs enabled the one-layer network of the 1960s and the 2-3 layer networks of the 80s to blossom into the 10, 15, 50-layer networks of today. That's what the deep in deep learning refers to, this layering of networks. The depth of the network's layers. And currently, deep learning is responsible for the best performing systems in almost every area of artificial intelligence. So what I'm arguing is that non-knowledge is in the shadows of these layers. It's in the depths that are being added in this layering of networks within these systems. And it's this layering that creates these spaces then for non-knowledge to be established. I'm just going to point towards a couple of indications of how non-knowledge is in these sort of hidden layers. Jeffrey Hinton, Computer Sciences, reveals that, talks about this. One very lucky thing happened to me at CMU. He's talking about back in the development of these systems. This is from an interview in 1995. Early on, when I was there, I had a graduate student called Peter Brown who knew a lot about speech recognition. We all knew about hidden Markov models. He talked about hidden Markov models while I was doing Boltzmann machines. I wish I'd understood more. But it goes on to explain here that this is the reason that they talk about hidden units, hidden networks in these hidden layers. That's where it comes from. It's borrowed from these other systems to describe the fact that they wanted to have so many layers that they couldn't really understand them or describe them. This is the media theorist Beatrice Fazzi talking about explainability in hidden layers. The network, however, is called deep if its structure encompasses intermediary hidden layers between the input and the output. The architecture of a deep learning system differs from that of standard artificial neural network precisely because of the presence of multiple nonlinear hidden layers. And this Fazzi continues, deep learning techniques are often opaque or illegible even to the programmers that set them up. And that's because I think that they are aiming to create the unexplainable. So I'm just going to go back before concluding, just back in history really, to the establishment of neural network systems and how I think they had a non-knowledge coded into them from the start. Here's Jack D. Cowan, a theoretical biologist, mathematician, describing a visit to Wilfred Taylor, who was developing a neural network, an analog neural network in the 1950s. And he found, Cowan describes, I found this sort of baffling machine. I tried to get him to explain to me how it worked. I couldn't. He didn't really understand himself what was going on, I think. And to this day in published papers, you can't quite understand how it works. The learning rule he's got is not associative, and yet the performance is. But there's something fishy about it, It was all done with analog circuitry. It took him several years to build and play with. So you've got in the 1950s, early analog neural networks still being unexplainable from the outset, and that not being seen to be an issue. Here's another similar example of this. Talking from the late 1970s, David Rumelhart talking about late 1970s and how psychology was being adapted. Hours and hours and hours of tinkering on the computer. We sat down and did all this in the computer and built these computer models, and we just didn't understand them. We didn't understand why they worked or why they didn't work or what was critical about them. So you've got this image. This is coding in of non-knowledge in the early neural network technologies. And as the depth of learning has continued, you've only got more of these hidden layers, which establish a greater sense of the non-knowledge and unexplainability, in which confidence is being projected over time as we rebalance the known and the not known in tension with one another. Back to Beatrice Fazzi, the media theorist, she says, the automated learning choices of a deep neural network are not yet fully understood by programmers. They're not yet fully understood by programmers. It's the yet here that I want to think about. So the knowledge, she continues, the knowledge generated in these models remains in part implicit due to the nonlinear nature of deep learning. It's compressed information and the distributed character of the network's representations, which rely on the many configurations of its large sets of variables. So it's not yet fully understood. Now, I just want to conclude now for the last couple of minutes, just to reflect on that. Now, what I'd suggest is through that account of neural networks and the algorithmic new life that those neural networks represent, the just around the corner changes, even though they're part of the world as it is today, is that non-knowledge is actually required for the systems to function. It's actually an aim that's coded into the culture and development of these forms of automation, of this algorithmic thinking. And advancing automation is actively justified and legitimized by the very fact that its outputs cannot be tracked. It's not about we can't explain them yet. It's that the aim is to make them increasingly unexplainable, to put more and more non-knowledge into the system, to imbalance the relation between the known and the not known, which I argue creates new tensions. So the system is justified, and its outputs are justified through the presence of unknowability, through the presence of non-knowledge. It's kind of part of how these systems, they are so advanced, they can't be understood. So it's like an argument for an ongoing advancement of the system is that more non-knowledge is needed, and that then impresses itself upon us. So non-knowledge is not accidental in algorithmic thinking or advanced forms of algorithmic thinking. It's the objective of those things. So this is just a final slide just to sort of conclude. So algorithmic thinking, we imagine these systems to be about creating knowledge, and they are. There are forms of knowledge that are created, but there are also then forms of non-knowledge that are created in parallel. So this type of algorithmic thinking doesn't eradicate or erode non-knowledge. It doesn't mean that non-knowledge disappears. It generates non-knowledge. It creates new forms of non-knowledge because it shows us where the limits are, which in turn then suggests what's beyond those limits and where the new limits might be, or this limitlessness might take us in this algorithmic new life that's being proposed. So they might create new knowns. They might reveal things about the social world, these automated systems, but in doing so, they're cultivating unknowns and unknowability. So if I'm just going to return once more to Bataille, this aim for unexplainability within the development of automation can be understood, I think, as a kind of suspension of the will to know. So what Michel Foucault describes as the will to know, this desire to know about things. There's a sort of kind of suspension of the will to know that can occur here. And instead, the will to know is supplanted or overridden by a mutation as the will to automate that's driving these things forward and that's allowing these systems to develop and advance in the way that they do. So that one of the things I argue in the close of the book is that what we've got is a development of a will to automate that has positioned itself within the development of these systems and development of knowledge over the period of time that I've looked at here, but particularly with advancing forms of automation that we've been seeing in more recent years. So that's where I'm going to leave you with the presences of non-knowledge and the will to automate.
Thank you very much, David, for the interesting presentation. Now we will pass to comments or questions from the audience. Please raise your digital hands. I see Daniel.
I'll take this as an opportunity to. Sorry, Rodrigo. Thought just doing a commercial on the screen for you there.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I thought I'd take the opportunity to make the commercial bid for the book. I got the slide there from publisher.
Yeah. So if you wanna do it.
That's it. That was it. That was okay. That was the extent of it, Rodrigo. I thought I'd give people thinking time.
Okay, Daniel.
Yes, I think it's fascinating, and I have one question and two short comments.
Okay.
The question is, I like the idea of distinguishing between the unknown, non-knowledge, and the unknowable. So unknown are things that are unknown yet. I think this is the one we can all relate rather easily. No, there are things I don't know, but I may know tomorrow. Society doesn't know, and it may know tomorrow. You try and push the argument that non-knowledge is something different, because the yet doesn't really apply. It is intrinsic to it. It is part of what it is. But the unknowable seems to have a rather different quality. I thought that you were kind of eliding non-knowledge and unknowable towards the end, because the unknowable, I mean, I'm not a religious person, but this is the kind of unknowable of God. Yeah. It has a different kind of metaphysical quality to it. Yeah. It is kind of beyond knowledge, which is non-knowledge is not beyond knowledge. The unknowable is.
Yeah, and this is exactly the thing that Bataille kind of struggles with in his accounts of what he's trying to say. I mean, one of the things that you could say is that the non-knowledge almost comes into is where the unknown and the unknowable come into view, or become somehow conscious to us, or become or are applied, or become part of the social world. I think he's trying to think about the way, like the consciousness of the absence of consciousness that he speaks about, is where those limits of the unknown and where they might be start to factor into how we relate and approach the social world. So I thought it's a kind of useful concept, because Bataille brings a set of things in that he attaches to non-knowledge. Now, whether the line can be drawn between the unknowable and non-knowledge, I'm not entirely sure, but I think it helps us to see how non-knowledge as a kind of idea can become present within an algorithmic system, and an awareness of the fact that we don't know. So it's kind of an object, in a say, it takes all of that unknown and unknowable. Non-knowledge is something that is pursued as a kind of entity, but Daniel, is, I would say, where Bataille's concept is a concept in tension itself. It's almost like it's not a concept. It's a type of, maybe this is something we could continue after, but it's not a kind of tool type concept. It's more of a concept to kind of just bring a sensitivity to what's there, to what's present, and how the limits of what we understand work. It's a tricky concept to use in that sense. It's not a kind of clear cut, here's my concept, I'm going to apply it. So I found it was useful for thinking about the way that they were pursuing something, and the thing they're pursuing is the non-knowledge as well as knowledge. It sort of gave it a tangibility, but I would agree that separating that between the unknown and unknowable and non-knowledge is a tricky thing to do, definitely. But I would say it's something like when the unknown and the unknowable becomes something that is attempted to be comprehended.
And so I think that leads well to my first comment. I'll be quick, Rodrigo. I won't take up too much time. Because of the pandemic, I was able to realize my dream of learning more about chess and learning how to play chess. And the way in which machines are being used in chess is absolutely fantastic. So they speak about a computer move as something objectively correct. Yeah. So when they're analyzing a game, they say, oh, this is a move no human will play. Yeah. Yeah, so, that's right. So it's interesting because these are neural networks. These are, they no longer want the computer to play as if they're humans, but they want humans to play as if they're machines. So it turns everything upside down in a kind of very applied sense. And one very short comment, so I don't have to trouble him. I like the fact that you're going back to the 1950s, and I'm thinking about Rodrigo's thesis here. It's the time of cybernetics. Yeah. So it's cybernetics that it's here, kind of opening the can of worms. Suddenly there are machines that can do stuff with information, and that's amazing. I mean, people don't know what to what to think of something like that.
Yeah.
These are machines that deal with information. So cybernetics kind of completely, it's a huge game changer. So I think your reference to the 1950s are extremely insightful. So thank you.
No, thanks, Daniel. I'll start with that just briefly on that. And I think you can see that there's a kind of parallel narrative around cybernetics and the development of neural networks and the establishment of these cognitive laboratories and stuff like that was going on. But also then the Lefebvre thing I started with about the vision of the future is in a similar time period as well. It's kind of that modernity and what's possible and what's being imagined it's part of the same, I don't know, structure of feeling or something from the time. But yeah, the chess one comes up in, as you can imagine, Daniel, in different places, and the Go game and everything, about how the AI playing chess. And the key distinction that's often made is, that there's the artificial intelligence systems working within rules, and then there's the ones that are creating the rules. That they're generative, they're generating rules and finding patterns that are outside of the limits of the game structure and its rules and rewriting them to, and so on. That's the kind of automation thing that I mentioned through Parisi, is that it becomes a kind of generative presence as well. And as you say, then we start to live to the models of those systems. I was reading Justin E.H. Smith's book, The Internet Is Not What You Think It Is, for a review. And one of the things he talks about there is how we start to become, we start to model ourselves on the algorithm. That's one of the arguments he makes in that book, actually, as well. So yeah, it's to do with who's in control of the rules there at that point, and how the rules emerge from these layers of neural networks and so on. That's potentially a powerful transformation that difficult to understand when you're trying to comprehend something like the social world.
Someone else? Dusan.
Hi, David.
Hello.
Thanks for the presentation.
That's okay.
I have a question about the tensions that they may be recognized in our understanding, our current understanding of the neural networks.
Yeah.
Maybe not in the precise sense of the non-knowable, the non-knowledge.
Yeah, yeah.
But from the critique of the neuronal ideology made by the French philosopher Catherine Malabou in her book, What Shall We Do with Our Brain? Malabou suggests in her book that several attributes related to the plasticity of our brain, such as our ability to adapt, to change, to be dynamic, to be flexible, are commonly understood as natural attributes. These attributes can be found at the same time in the new spirit of capitalism, described by Boltanski and Chapiello.
Yeah.
However, according to Malabou, this plastic conception, forgets the dialectical character of the plasticity. The brain, for example, presents resistance in forming its own identity, and can even collapse under certain inputs from the environment or under certain circumstances.
Yeah.
So our task for Malabou will be to recover freedom beyond this flexibility, this dynamical process offered by the classical image of neural networks. So I would like to ask you, according to your own research, how do you assess these tensions between the neuronal ideology or neural networks and its effects on our contemporary society?
Wow, yeah.
In that sense, that's a critical sense. And
well, if I just start with the notion of the tension, and that might sort of lead me towards some sort of answer to that question, which is clearly really challenging to be able to fully comprehend and to fully answer it. The reason I went for the route of the kind of tensions, Dusan, is because because what I was thinking was that you don't really get a full picture of these algorithmic systems and their implications, if you kind of ignore the tensions that are created. So, what I've tried to do in the book is to take each of those tensions on that I mapped out, and each chapter looks at one vector within that. So the one I looked at today was non-knowledge, but I've got another chapter that's about how knowledge is generated through algorithmic systems as well. So the idea is that they're kind of pulling against each other. Now, there are lots of, and the other aspect of it that I didn't explore today at all was the way in which the human is managed within these systems. So how forms of agency are combined within systems, with some systems being founded upon the security that comes from removing the human, and others being founded upon the idea that human discretion is needed in order to achieve exactly what you just described, of the flexibility of thought that is seen to be a human property. So that kind of explores that. It relates a little bit more perhaps directly to the question that you've asked there. Now, the notion of freedom and so on that you mentioned associated with that, what I'm suggesting is that this algorithmic thinking is going to be part of the social world now as an ongoing presence, and that therefore we need to understand the tensions that places us within in order to understand our part in the social world and how the social world functions more broadly. So we need to see the tensions will move, but I think they'll always be on those vectors: humanlessness, knowing, not knowing. I think is likely to always be in place, but it will shift about depending on the cultural transformations and so on, the technological transformations that come in, and unbalance that confidence in the known and not known that Zimmel spoke about. So I'm not sure I can fully answer your question, but what I would say is that I think we need to see ourselves as being a site of tension in these algorithmic systems in which we are placed, and in which the social world itself is moving around as a result of the pull and push of those tensions, which then define the algorithmic future we live in. The tensions that are going to dictate or define the direction that algorithmic systems of the future take, I think. Now, Dusan, I'm afraid I don't know if I can answer your question any further than that, because I don't know if I've got I might be at the limits of what I'm able to provide in response to that challenge, really, if that makes sense.
Perfect. Jorge?
Yes.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you for your talk, David. Very scary in a wide sense. And thanks to the organizers as well, Rodrigo, Dusan, and Daniel. I just want to ask about what do you think about the consequences of that you explain to the interaction between humans and robots into the future, because robots maybe are going to be made by these kinds of technology, as neural networks, deep learning, and all of the other technologies linked to them. So what can be the consequences to the social structure, for example, even in the traditional way, in terms of class division, for example, or something like that? That's what I want to ask you.
Yeah, I mean, that's really important, isn't it? I think, one of the observations I would make, just to start that off, is that, where we kind of would have thought of the social world as being made up of human decisions and human choices, as social scientists, we need to rethink that as a starting point. A sort of base premise needs to be, actually, there's other decision makers. What Catherine Hales calls cognizers. There's other cognizers in this that we're surrounded by, making those decisions. So we need to approach the world and understand the world from that basis, I think, which is a big challenge, I think, for the social sciences, because it requires a rethinking of a lot of ideas. I mean, one of the things I would say there, you finished about talking about social class. Well, if we think of the relationship between class and culture, then people's cultural consumption is not dictated by algorithms, but is shaped by their relationship with algorithmic structures. So if my cultural capital, to go to a kind of classic Bourdieu kind of position, is I'm socialized into a position within the class structure through who I know and where I live and my friends and family and so on. But what if algorithms are shaping what I'm listening to and what I'm watching? At that point, then we need to rethink the relationship between culture and class, potentially. Not to say that those class structures break down, but that they're being configured differently within consumption, potentially. In terms of the future, I would suggest that one of the key questions within this is what I describe as a kind of meshing of agency. So how forms of agency combine within the social world is changing. So when you look at a lot of the literature on the use on algorithmic systems, there's still human intervention going on. There's human oversight, or in other cases, there isn't. So, and this is where the tension emerges about how much human is in this meshing of agency that is occurring in the social world. Now, I don't have an answer as to what the right level of agency meshing is, but I think it's interesting to think about how that's managed. So one of the chapters in the book, I look at how BlackRock, they've got a piece of software called Aladdin, which is a kind of risk management software. I look at how they position the human within, they kind of reposition the human within that system as having oversight within this analytical factory that they depict. Whereas the study I do of blockchain is all about removing the human, removing the intermediary in order to achieve security. And here's an example of the tension that emerges about how much human you have in the mix in your system. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's like, I think where this points us is, how do you understand the relation, this mixing of agency that goes on in the social world and the different balances that you find in different places. I'll give you one more example, very brief example. At the moment I'm part of a team run by Alison Wallace, looking at algorithms in housing decisions. So we're going to be, over the next 2 years, looking at how algorithms are used to affect choices that are made about housing, so rental, loans around housing and so on, to see how much human intervention and how much algorithmic intervention goes on within the housing, to try to get at that question a little bit more.
Rodrigo?
Thank you, David. Always this kind of conversation reminds me a quote of someone I cannot spell the name. We put here in the chat. My Dutch is worse than my English, so I put there. But reminds me that quote. Now, the question of whether machines can think is about as relevant as the question of whether submarines can swim. So, but I think always I don't know. I think it's more complex than that. No, but I want to say your work, like the work of Catherine Hales or Beatrice Fassi, just for name a few, like you did, that seeks to get out of the question of what is human left in a technological world, in your case for knowledge, If I understand correctly, your point is that, there are different ways of knowledge that not depend of human operation, Also, this theoretical problem is not whether if they are translations of characteristics of human operations, like knowledge human knowledge, but how to interpret these technical ways of knowledge.
Yeah.
So
in fact, yeah. Sorry, Rodrigo.
So I'd like to ask you, how from your perspective, we should manage the social dimension and the effects of technical futures without falling into anthropocentric versions, of the social, like you made this different,
Yeah.
So that is the question. Sorry for.
Well, that's great, Rodrigo. What I would suggest is that the idea that these machines think like a human is there to be analysed itself. So you think, well, what are they suggesting then? And I do this a little bit more in the chapter. What do they imagine a human cognition to be that they then turn into machine cognition? So that in a sense could be part of the object of study, I think, is trying to understand what human thinking is imagined to be. And that has changed over time. And I think when you look back as well, the idea of what a neural net, what a neuron was and things like that was different over that period of time. So the very notion of what human thinking is has changed. That's right. Yeah. So I was trying to kind of make that part of the analysis, is trying to think about how human thinking is framed and then adapted into these systems. Yeah, whether or not they can think, that's like what I'm sort of interested in is how they are presented as being able to think or not think, how they're framed in those ideas. And this is what that idea of the algorithmic new life, Rodrigo, is trying to get at. The idea that just around the corner is a machine that can do this. It's nearly here. It's not quite yet, but it's nearly here. Idea about what these technologies can do. They can think like a human. And there are approaches to artificial intelligence that are based upon this idea that we're going through steps or phases in artificial intelligence, and at the end they'll have achieved this perfect moment in which they can do anything, sort of thing. But that's, I'd be thinking, how do we analyze those ideas about what the future is and what this type of thinking is that's driving it? And that's what my idea of the will to automate is about, that I'm hoping to develop more if I can get some funding for it, would be to try to unpick the desire to automate and why that desire takes certain forms and why automation is seen as desirable in certain settings, and unpick that historically and in the moment to think through the will to automate that's driving us towards those futures.
Renzo.
Thank you, David, for the reflections.
Thank you.
And my question is related to the previous one. It's more thinking in we can say organological aspect, taking Stigler's notion of organology, not divided algorithms from human, but taking as an all constitutions as evolutionary species. As a this aspect, in this sense, is open the question: how do we know? How do we know in a phenological aspect as a species, as a human species, since the beginning of the origin of us? How the evolution of knowing, I don't know if calling evolution, or I don't know if they have this kind of terminology of evolution, but we know different from 100 years ago or 50 years ago, but and it's continue in this aspect with the machines and the algorithms and et cetera, et cetera. So how we can think for you, maybe in a speculative aspects, thinking this new general constitution, general ecology of living time, non-human time, non-human time, human knowledge, non-human knowledge, taking into account, of course, that algorithms are more, it's proof that are more 100 times adaptive in knowledge than human beings. There are more openness, there are more meta-stabilities aspect of relation with everything information, with all the information taking into account that we consume information too, and we are conducted by information. So how we can think in this collaborating aspects of machines, algorithms, and humans in this aspect of knowledge, no? More in the sense that dividing, this is no good, this is good, but no, not taking in a socio-technical aspect. How do you see that? How do you looking forward for that?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, I mean, I would say, you know, like I think in kind of genealogical terms about what we're seeing as much as possible. It's not always easy to piece together the documents of this type of work, because the documents can be a bit strange. They can be bits and pieces of web materials and all sorts. Try to do that in my book, The Data Gaze. Try to look at different types of documents and kind of think about the archive differently there. But I think you could go down the route here of thinking that although it's genealogical, there are transformations that are restructuring how people think. Okay, so the presence of the presence of algorithms and algorithmic systems and other types of automation has undoubtedly escalated and taken on new forms and found its way into our lives in lots of different ways, through our devices, through our systems that we use, and so on. Now, you could go down the Catherine Hales route here, which I think is compelling, which is that then does change the way we think, because the world is structured for us in different ways. So we start to see and understand the world. So we read differently, we think differently, we interact differently in line with the logic of these systems. So I do think there's something to be said for that argument, because particularly, I mean, one of the, when I work with my students and get them to think about what they know of the world that isn't a product of their social media newsfeed and their search engine ranking algorithm, is a mechanism for getting to see how the world is structured for them through algorithmic systems. So it's a complicated one, Renzo, because it's difficult to know how you can understand human thinking outside of a algorithmic structure, because although you can separate them out, we're still consuming and reading, and the world's presented to us through algorithmic structures. Even social research is algorithmic in the sense that what we read as researchers, how we go about the work that we do, are structured through algorithmic systems quite often, not always, I mean, but they can be. And the things we encounter might be from our social media feeds or from things that come through from Google Scholar and so on, So it's difficult to separate out sort of human thinking from algorithmic structures because we're living within them. And I think that's where I've been quite inspired over years by Catherine Hale's approach towards thinking about how, the post-human structures are kind of, we're inseparable from those systems really in the way that we think. I think it's quite a compelling position from her. The last thing that you raised is about limits. One thing that George Simmel says in his late works is that we're more aware of limits when they're breached. So he gives an example. I can't remember what the story is. Someone coming out of prison. A story is like I can't remember what the nature of the story was. Someone comes out and they didn't realize they're in prison until they came out. And so Simmel gives this kind of crude example really as a way of thinking about the limits and boundaries of knowledge that contain the way we think, and then trying to understand how those limits are breached or transformed once new knowledge is obtained. So that's why I've got the knowledge and the knowing and unknowing intention in the book, is because as we know things, we're also creating new forms of the unknown. I don't know if that answers that, Renzo, because these are challenging questions.
Yeah, you answered. Thank you very much, David. But I was thinking because in the beginning, noesis, it was the mean for intelligentsia. After intelligentsia, it was noesis. So in that aspect, humans, knowledge, humans, knowledge in the sense of more interior and exterior. But after that, it's more exterior.
Yeah. I mean,
now it's more relational than causal.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, in metric power, but metric power, I track this back, try and track it back a couple of 100 years to think about the rise of statistics and social statistics and how that had a transformative effect as well, so over time, you got that transformation, but then it's at the point, I think, when you've got this escalation of algorithmic structures, then you do get a reconfiguration then of kind of how the social world works once more decisions are taken outside of human intervention or in collaboration with human intervention. Thanks. Dusan.
Yeah. Maybe Matthias, if you can ask a question.
Yes.
Are you sure? I can. Are you sure, Dusan?
Yes.
I don't want to. Great. Well, thank you, David, for your presentation, and also thank you for your newsletter. I'm a huge fan of the fragment.
Oh, thanks, Matthias. Thanks for reading.
And I just wanted to ask you two connections that might sound very strange, but yeah. I was very curious to because I was reading this book of Robert Proctor. It is about this concept of agnotology. That is basically the idea of the pursuit of making ignorance. And he produced this kind of a statement based on the case of the tobacco industry and how the cigarette industry produced a lot of studies to confuse the public and to produce ignorance. And I was thinking that when you were saying this kind of, we need more layers, I was thinking maybe the new layers are the same kind of how we deal with science. We did more research and we never reached this kind of conclusion of, for example, the effect of smoking is bad, the cigarettes produce cancer. We never reached that kind of a statement because we always need more research. And I was thinking in the case of AI, it was funny with this kind of connection. We always need more layers. I don't know if it is you consider that kind of that idea. And the second connection that I wanted to ask you is, how do you relate this kind of non-knowledge with idiocy, with the idea of the idiot? Because I was wondering, maybe the engineers pursued this kind of, we don't know how the machine works, but we are able to define when the machine is working well, and how they establish, how they can establish that kind of distinction that maybe we don't know how the models are working and how they are, what they are producing, but we know that they are working well in a way that they are producing what we want to produce, right? So how do you relate this kind of non-knowledge with the idea of the idiocy that we can't speak the same language, but we understand it, and we try to produce something.
So let me start with that last bit. So that's the kind of the unsupervised learning type thing, is how do you know that what you're producing, the system produces, is an accurate or useful outcome? I mean, so that takes us back to some of the arguments that are made about the way that the people coding the algorithms, how their vision of the world becomes part of these algorithmic systems, because the expected outcomes get coded into the system, or as you're describing it, how do you know the system works? Because it's producing the outcome we want. So, or an outcome we think is viable or right. So there's an account of the world that is being used to judge whether the system works. So you've got, this is where, if you look at someone like Wendy Chun's work on discriminating data, the idea that you might not know how the system works, but the outcome can embed prejudice and discrimination into the system, because you've already got a model of prejudice discrimination that's used to judge whether or not the system's working. So that's the response to the second part. But the first part, I mean, that's an amazing connection. And I mean, the production of ignorance, clearly what you've got there is contextually something quite different, but a clear connection in the nature of what you might be thinking about. Ignorance and idiocy, it would be, you might have to think about how they fit into Zimmel's notion of the balance of the unknown, or into Bataille's notion of non-knowledge. I think a key difference would be that what we're looking at is the way these things are coded into an actual system, a structure itself that's part of the social world, rather than just being about knowledge. But also the aim of the layering and depths that I've discussed is not necessarily to hide something. It's not to create a kind of fog around knowledge. It's to enable the systems to develop in a way that is seen to be desirable and more advanced. So, and at the same time, Matthias, that's where you've got to think about the tension in this, which is that these systems, although they are forms of non-knowledge, might create insights into the social world that become knowledge as well. So they might produce new insights at the same time as producing non-knowledge. So it's not necessarily idiocy or ignorance that's being produced. It's a tension between the knowing and not knowing that we could miss if we forget the tension aspect, which is that these systems are also intended to create new knowns often. That's what I would say. So it's a little bit different in that regard. It's looking to pursue non-knowledge. It's in tension with knowledge, not necessarily to make or produce ignorance or idiocy. Although I think that could be an interesting, if you want to think about the politics of these systems, potentially. The tech companies that are working on these things might have different aims that might be more aligned, I don't know.
Thank you, David.
But that's an amazing connection, definitely. Never even thought of making that connection.
We have Dusan.
Dusan?
Yes, I'm thinking about your reference to George Bataille.
Yeah.
And the desire orient towards the non-knowledge.
Yeah.
What do you think are the pathological consequence or psychoanalytical consequence for, say, something of this model based on instability you present? I'm thinking, for example, in cases like burnout cases, and especially considering that the last chapter of your book refers precisely to the will to automate, that relation between the knowledge and the desire or the will to orient towards something.
Yeah, well, the idea is that in this chapter that I present today is that there's a kind of suspension of the will to know, so that it's not, in order to achieve this kind of vision of the future, this algorithmic new life, that in part requires a kind of suspension of the will to know and its replacement with a will to automate. So the desire to automate things overtakes the desire to fully understand things, in other words. So that's where the pursuit of non-knowledge comes in. It's part of a broader will to automate, a desire to make more and more of the social world algorithmic and automated and apply artificial intelligence to it. So I think that's where I'd point you towards in answering that question, Dusan. Have I understood fully?
Yes.
Follow up.
Yes, I think you respond the connection between the will to automate and the orientation towards the non-knowledge in a Bataillean sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated set of connections, but I think that the non-knowledge aspect is important because otherwise you would just have the will to know.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas once you start once you start pursuing non-knowledge, something is changing in that structure. And I think therefore it's kind of a mutation of that into the will to automate, a desire to automate more and more aspects of the social world. So it's interesting to think then where that desire comes from and what's fueling it, I think.
Thank you.
So if it's not more question, someone else? So, but we are in time, so I want to say thanks again, David. This was an excellent conversation. I think for everyone was an honor to listen to you. And also many thanks for each of you, the participants in this session. And we hope you enjoy it. And we want to see you the next one. And mine, when is the date?
The 30th of May.
I don't know if you want to say
Monday.
Your last something else, David, for closure.
Just thanks. Notice that the honor was mine. Thank you for the absolutely amazing questions. That's they were challenging questions. So thank you very much for those, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. So see you. Have a nice day to everyone.
Thank you very much. Thanks.